This morning we're looking at a topic, engaging with the world. And so without any further ado, I'd like you to welcome Alister McGrath to the podium this morning, and in a traditional Bermudian way, and it's lovely to have you.
Well, good morning, and it's really lovely to be back here in Bermuda. And I'm really glad to be able to give this lecture in honor of Canon Thomas and Winifred Nisbet, celebrating their great work and witness here. And what I want to do in this lecture is reflect on the whole issue of how we engage in our culture. I came to Bermuda back in 1990, and as I was being driven through Hamilton on my way to the hotel last night, I was just reflecting on how much it had changed. You know, there are new buildings everywhere. It's as if things are changing very, very quickly in the, 25 years since I was last here. And I think many of us find change a little bit troubling. We wonder, what's the future going to be like? How does the church fit into this? How does our personal faith rest with this massive change we see all around us? And in this lecture, really, I want to begin to engage with some of those questions. They're very good questions. I think there are two things I want to do. They may seem to point in different directions, but I think they are the same halves of the same coin. I want to reassure you. I also want to challenge you. I want to reassure you that we can cope with this change, that there is a place for the church, a place for our faith in the midst of this. And I also want to challenge us as to how we might engage better with our culture. Because in many ways, every one of us here this morning is an interface or a point of contact between the Christian faith or the church and the culture around us. And in many ways, we've got to ask, what can I do as someone who might be the point of contact between this person and the Christian faith to help them understand more about it? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we are seeing around us, and then reflect on some of the things that we can do in responding to it. I think one of the points I want to begin by making is that Christians have always had to learn to cope with change. If you look at the very long history of the Christian church, you see Christians struggling to find acceptance in the Roman Empire. Then the Roman Empire collapses, and they struggle to find a way ahead without Rome. They find themselves always facing big challenges as one situation they've got used to begins to fade away, and something new begins to emerge, which nobody really understands. And very often we feel we're poised on the brink between a past that we know quite well, but seems to be receding, and a future that we don't really understand, but is clearly on the way. And I want to say that Christians have always felt like that. It's unsettling, I know, but nevertheless there are a lot of things that we can say and think as we begin to engage with them. So let's begin by thinking about what the Christian faith is all about. And clearly there are many things that could be said. But let me just begin by picking out a few themes which seem to me to be enormously important. Christianity engages with some of the deepest questions that people ask. What is life all about? Do I really matter? What is going on here? And in many ways, that question, what is going on here, is really very, very important. As I think some of you will know, I recently wrote a biography of C.S. Lewis. And Lewis made this very interesting transition from being an atheist, actually quite an aggressive atheist, to being a Christian. And one of the things that really moved him to faith was his growing realization that Christianity offered a way of looking at things, a way of seeing things, a way of making sense of things, which was far better than his atheism ever was. And Lewis talks about the Christian faith being something that lights up the world, that makes sense of things. And one of his most famous statements goes like this: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not just because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. And the point that Lewis is making is that Christianity gives us a way of thinking about things. If you like, it's a lens that brings into focus things that would otherwise seem fuzzy or blurry. I mean, if you take Richard Dawkins, for example, who the bishop was mentioning a moment ago, Richard Dawkins famously declares that when we look at the world, we see no meaning, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But C.S. Lewis would ask him, what happens if your lens is out of focus? What happens if the meaning is really there? It's just that you've missed it. So I think that whole theme of making sense of things really is important. It's important, I think, for each of us, because we're trying to understand who we are. We're trying to understand the difference that we can make to God's world. And we're also, I think, reflecting on other questions as well. For example, what is the meaning of life? And what I want to say to you right from the beginning is people are still asking those questions. They may be a little bit beneath the surface, but they really are there. And one of the things that you and I have got to try and do is to figure out how to help people see what Christianity is all about. And we're doing that in a cultural situation where there's been a change in mood. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is talk about some of the changes in mood that we're seeing. So let's just look at a number of things that seem to be happening. One of them is sometimes described in terms of a change from modernity to postmodernity. But we don't have to use that language at all. We can say it's a change from a way of thinking that's based on argument to a rather different way of thinking that's more based on stories and on images. And the result is that those of us like me who got so good at, in effect, using arguments to show that Christianity makes sense need to realize that very often in our new cultural situation, especially when we're dealing with younger people, that those arguments don't cut as much ice as they might have a generation ago. For many younger people, it's not so much arguments, it's stories and images that really matter. I'm getting on, but I'm just old enough to remember the introduction of British commercial television. And I can remember an early commercial for toothpaste. And what happened was that this man in the white coat appeared on the screen and said, holding up a tube of toothpaste, there are 6 scientifically proven reasons why you should use this toothpaste. In other words, it's an argument. But if you look at modern advertisements for toothpaste, they tend to be incredibly suave people, walking into the bathroom with the toothpaste there, and the implication is you use this and you can look as suave and elegant as I am. So it's a different kind of approach altogether. And what I want to say is that this change is happening around us. But I also want to say we shouldn't be worried about this. There's just something that's happening, and there are lots of resources that we can use to begin to engage with it. Let me just mention some that are very obvious. First of all, let's take this new interest in stories. People very often will say, well, look, you're telling me about Christianity. I don't want to hear that, but I am interested in hearing your story. And that's a different idea altogether. What I want to say is that each of us does have a story we can tell. For some of you, it may be about coming to faith and the difference it made to you. For most of you, I suspect, it's much more about growing up in your faith and gradually coming to realize how important it was. And each of you will be able to tell a story, which is about how my faith makes a difference to my life. And that's a story your culture would like to hear. And let me emphasize this point very, very strongly. There's a world of difference between 2 statements. Here's the first: this is true. Here's the second: this is real. There are lots of things that are true that just don't make any difference to anybody at all. For example, I'm absolutely right in saying Queen Victoria died in 1901. But I don't think any of you are going to, in effect, feel that that gives you a reason for getting up in the morning, But if something is real, it makes a difference. That's the point. And Christianity is both true and real. And by telling your story, you're in effect saying, let me tell you how my faith is real for me. And you might like to think about that. If I had to write down on a piece of paper 2 or 3 reasons why my faith makes a difference to my life, what would they be? Because if you're talking to your friends, to your neighbors about the difference that faith makes, you will be able to say, let me tell you of the difference that my faith makes to my life. That's about faith being real. Again, one of the transitions we're seeing is moving away from a culture that says we want proof to a culture that says we want something that's going to work. And again, each of us can try and tell a story in which we can talk about the way in which our faith works for us, the way in which it gives us stability, it gives us identity, it reassures us that each of us really matters to God. Think of Psalm 8. Begins by surveying the heavens, and then in effect says, the God who made those made me as well. And it's a wonderful thought. So I think we need to begin to think about how we might connect up with the culture outside the church by telling our stories. One of the things that we're seeing in England, and I think you're seeing it here as well, is that our culture isn't hostile to faith in particular. There are people like Richard Dawkins, but they are very loud and slightly exceptional. But there is a growing gap opening up between a church culture and an ordinary culture. And the ordinary culture doesn't really get what Christianity is all about. And so the point I want to make is that each of you here this morning could be the person that in effect helps somebody else begin to get what Christianity is all about. You can't leave this to the clergy. We've all got to be part of this. So we're seeing this cultural move towards stories and also towards images. And I want to say these really are very, very helpful indeed. And the Bible is rich in these images. Let me just mention one and talk about it a little bit. The Lord is my shepherd. That's Psalm 23, and we all know that image very, very well. It's an extremely powerful image, and it's something we can talk about with those who are from an unchurched culture, but it's extremely easy to understand, and you can also begin to open up the difference that it makes. Let me just give you a few examples to show you how we can use this. First of all, it begins by reminding us that we are all on a journey. That's a very important theme for many. You hear ordinary people talking about their personal journey or their walk. They're wondering where they're going. We're all on a journey. And Psalm 23 is saying that as we journey, we do not journey on our own. We are accompanied by God, who is always there and who is always there for us. Even, to use the language of the King James Bible, even when we pass through the valley of the shadow of death, God is there by our side. Now, that is a very powerful thought indeed. It certainly means a lot to me. I'm sure it means a lot to most of you as well. But the point is, this can really help those who are outside the church begin to get a glimpse of what faith might be all about. It's all about realizing that we don't journey on our own, that there is someone who is there for us, and in one sense, faith is reaching out our hand and taking hold of God and inviting him to journey with us as we walk the walk of faith. So that image, I think, is very accessible and one that I think could be very helpful in beginning to open up the way in which people think about their faith. But there is another theme that we're seeing in our culture. Again, it's there in England, and I think you're beginning to feel it as well. And that is a cultural suspicion of institutions. In England, we've got a lot of people who are very suspicious of government, who are very suspicious of the banking industry, who are very suspicious of anything that's institutional, I'm afraid, including the church. Why? Because in effect, there's this feeling that in some way, in England, the established church, the Church of England, is part of the establishment, and that in effect means that it's distanced from the life of ordinary people. And what we're seeing in England is a change in vocabulary. People are beginning to avoid using the word religion, because for many people, the word religion implies institutional religion. And instead, they're using the word spirituality. That means a personal faith that's not connected with an institution. And so what I want to say to you is you may find this sense of unease here as well. That people, in effect, will be very glad to hear about you and your faith, but they might be more cautious when you come to talking about the church. Now, my experience has been that once people begin to attend church and settle in, those suspicions go very, very quickly. But from the outside looking in, those suspicions can be there. And again, each of you can be an ambassador, an ambassadress, someone who's able to reach outside to begin to help other people to see what the church is there for, the difference that it makes, and eventually to begin to become part of a church culture as well. So I think there are some very important themes to make there. There is this cultural mood that is changing, but it's something that we will be able to deal with. And in many ways, my task this morning is both to reassure you, look, we can cope with this. In fact, more than that, we can rise to this. But there is also this challenge. If we do nothing, I'm afraid things are not going to get any better. And in many ways, the challenge I'm just issuing is this. What might you be able to do to enable connections to be made, to enable people to begin to perhaps understand what Christianity is, to work out what the church really is there for? And that, I think, is something that's very important indeed. So let me do a little bit of theology in taking all of this further. The point I'm going to make is that we need to translate the Christian faith into a language that our culture can understand. Now, I suspect many of you will read C.S. Lewis. Why is that? Because he is very, very good at translating the vocabulary of the Christian faith into an ordinary language that people can understand very, very easily. And interestingly, as some of you will know, Lewis learned that lesson the hard way. In 1940, when the Second World War was in its second year, Lewis was invited to go around Royal Air Force bases and talk to ground crews. These were people who had left school at 16. They were not educated. Lewis was a lecturer at Oxford University, used to talking to very well-educated people. He had to change his whole way of presenting things to be able to connect up with this new audience. It was a challenge, but he rose to it, and he did it very well. What I want to say to you is we need to be able to do this as well. Lewis talked about this in a lecture he gave in 1945. And he says, look, we've got to learn the language of our audience. Find out the words they use and translate our theology, the way we think about the Christian faith, into what Lewis calls the cultural vernacular. In other words, ordinary ways of speaking. And each of us can be an interpreter, in effect saying, look, here is how I would begin to explain this idea in language that's very accessible to ordinary people. So Lewis realized this. He said, look, the test of whether you've understood anything yourself is whether you can translate it into plain language. Because if you can't translate, you haven't understood in the first place. But I think this is important to us. Because many of us get very used to the language of the prayer book, to the language of Scripture, to the language of the tradition, and we're very, very comfortable with it. But the difficulty is that very often that language doesn't connect up with our ordinary, everyday culture. Let me give you an example. In Romans chapter 5, Paul talks about being justified by faith. And he is very excited about this. Clearly, the whole idea of justification is really important to him. But in ordinary, everyday English, the word justification means two things. Number one, it means an excuse for arriving late at work. I offered a justification for my late arrival. Or it means what you do in a word processor to get that right-hand margin sorted out. Now, I'm sure there are very good preachers here who will be able to do something with both of those meanings, but it's not what Paul meant at all. And that's our challenge, to try and take words from the Christian tradition, take ideas, and in effect unpack them in ways that are going to connect up with our culture, telling stories, using examples, making connections, which reflect the fact that you know, first of all, the Christian faith, but also the people that you're talking to. So what I'm going to do, if I may, is just take one example and think it through with you. And what I'm going to do is to say, look, what is the cross of Christ all about? Now, if I was giving a lecture on that, we'd be here for quite a long time. But what I'm going to suggest is that there might be four major meanings to which you probably would like to add others as well. First of all, the cross and resurrection is about a victory over death and the birth of hope. That's very important. Secondly, the cross is about the forgiveness of sins. Thirdly, the cross is about healing, making people whole. And fourthly, the cross is about reminding us of the love of God. Now, some of you will say, well, there are other things you could add, surely, and you're right. But just for our purposes this morning, let's look at each of those. Because, you see, my point is this. Each of you could be somebody who translates those into language, into words that will make sense to your culture. Let's look at the first. The cross is all about hope. It's all about being able to live, not being frightened of death. It's a very important theme indeed. And it's one that our culture needs to hear. One of my favorite films is the Woody Allen film, Hannah and Her Sisters. And some of you will have seen this, and if you've seen it, you'll remember the bit where Woody Allen thinks he may have a brain tumor. Now, in fact, he has a slight cold. But he goes to bed one night thinking, I've got a brain tumor, I'm going to die. Okay, I can handle this. 5 seconds later, he wakes up in the middle of the night covered in a cold sweat saying, my God, I'm going to die. I can't cope with this. And what I want to say to you is, there are a lot of people in your culture who have not begun to live because they're frightened by death. What I want to say is that there's something very significant you might be able to say that would make a connection between the Bible, the liturgy of the church, your personal faith, and that kind of person. And certainly I know once, having a very, very interesting conversation with somebody based on the 1662 Book of Common Prayer funeral service, which might seem a curious starting point, but that's how it happened. And he was fascinated by the words spoken as the priest brings the coffin into the church. I am the resurrection and the life, says the Lord. And we talked about those, and I tried to translate them into his language, and I was lucky. It worked. But the point is, we can all try and do this. How would you begin to tell somebody what this hope is all about, the difference it makes to you, and why it might make a difference to somebody else? Or secondly, the theme of forgiveness, real forgiveness of real sins. It's a very powerful theme. It's a very liberating theme. Because there are many, as you will know, who have done something or had something done to them which makes them feel they are struggling under a burden of guilt, and maybe nobody else knows about it. And they are wondering what can be done to take this away from me. You might think of Pilgrim's Progress, which makes this point very, very well. And of course, the Christian faith has this very powerful answer that in some way Christ's death means that our sins are taken away so that we may get up and rise as forgiven men and women of God. Now again, how would you explain that? What stories might you tell? What analogies might you use to help somebody outside the Christian church grasp what that's all about? Or thirdly, the idea of being broken, being wounded, being damaged. There are many people who said to me something like this: my life is a mess. I need somebody to put me back together again. Now that's a beautiful way of speaking that connects up with this great theme of healing that we find throughout the Bible, but especially in the New Testament. Because the word we translate by healing has this deeper sense of making whole. In effect, restoration, putting people back together again, binding their wounds, enabling them to become the people that they are meant to be. And I'm sure there are people here this morning who'll be able to say something like this: my faith helped me put my life back together again, or my faith helped me cope as my life began to fall to pieces following the death of a dear friend or something like that. If that's true for you, other people need to hear that story. Because you may say, look, I couldn't frame this in very rich and complicated theological terms. Well, you don't worry about that. What you are able to do is say, look, let me try and tell you in my own words the difference that my faith made, how it helped me to cope with that very difficult time, how it gave me hope in the face of great sorrow and despair. And I think we can do that. And people, I want to say to you, will listen to that story because they're aware that their story might be changed by the story that you're telling. Or fourthly, this great theme of the cross being about the love of God. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and so on. One of those comfortable words that we read with such pleasure. And it's a very important theme because, again, there are many out in the wider culture who feel they don't matter to anyone. And they are wondering, where can I find someone who will love me, who will care for me? And you can see immediately how you could tell a very powerful story about how the death of Christ is really about reassuring each of us and those beyond us how much we matter to a God who created us in the first place and gave himself for us in the second. So I think there are many things that could be said there. I used to enjoy watching the American TV show Cheers. Now, probably many of you will say, well, you're clearly a very strange person. Well, let's just forget that. But Cheers was very, very popular. It ran for, I think it was 11 series, which is a lot. And one of the reasons why it was so popular is it was all about a sense of community. It's all about a bar in Boston. And outside the bar, there is this vast, faceless world where people are impersonal, where, in fact, people don't matter, they're anonymous. Then inside this bar, people know each other. They look out for each other. They matter. And you may remember the jingle, where they all know your name and they're always glad you came. And that is important. People like to feel they matter as people, as individuals. And the Christian faith has a lot to say about that. And I'm sure each of you could be a brilliant interpreter of the Christian faith as you try to say, look, let me try and explain how my faith reassures me that I really matter, that I am precious, that I'm important, that there's something God wants me to do. Let me try and help you understand how I do that, because this might refer to you as well. So what I'm saying really is, look, we've been given a treasure chest, if you like. The Christian faith is like a treasure chest full of jewels. And part of our own discipleship can be, in effect, saying, look, I've got to really appreciate my own faith a bit better. I don't know what you do at Lent. Sometimes I read improving books. Sometimes I just think about my faith and try to understand it better. But use that analogy of the treasure chest. You're picking up something and you're looking at it and you're saying, that's wonderful. I think I've got that. You put it back in. Next item, this is all about resurrection. I think I've got that, and so on. It's really about trying to make sure you've appreciated what this is all about and figured out how you might be able to help somebody else figure out what it's all about as well. And that imagery of jewelry is very, very powerful. Think, for example, of the parable of the pearl of great price. You find that in Matthew 13. It's all about this merchant who we assume knows a good thing when he sees it, being very wealthy, seeing this pearl and realizing that until and unless he possesses that, nothing else matters. So he sells everything in order to own that pearl. And it's a wonderful image, a wonderful story, because it's all about there being something that really is worth having. And of course, it's an image for the Christian faith itself. So what I'm talking about really is figuring out how we can begin to develop ways of engaging with our culture. But some of you will say, well, look, we can understand the point you're making, but this isn't really for me. This is for somebody else. I personally don't think that somebody like me would be able to do that. Now, if you're thinking like that, I'm going to say some things which I hope may be helpful. First of all, most Christians feel completely inadequate. They feel that God kind of way likes them by accident because he doesn't really know what we're really like. And I think we just need to get used to the idea that God knows us and loves us. There are no secrets of any kind from him. He knows us in all our weaknesses, in all our failures, but he is able and he is delighted to take us and use us. And if you look at church history, it's full of examples of people who felt, I'm no good, ending up doing some remarkable things. Why? Because in the end, it's not really us. It's really God using us. Do you remember that very famous passage in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians where he talks about the thorn in the flesh, which stopped him doing some missionary journeys? And it's all about Paul realizing that even in his weakness, he is able to serve God. And if you read that passage sometime, you'll hear God speaking words to Paul, which I think he would speak to all of us here this morning. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. In other words, it doesn't matter if we feel inadequate. We just do our best and we let God do the rest. I think that is really important because I think some people feel you have to go through some kind of theological qualification exam before you can talk to people outside the church about Christianity. It's not like that. Who you are, the position you are, whether it's in a family, in society, in school, whatever it is, that brings you into contact with people who may see you as the only point of contact between themselves and the church. And so I want to say that you must never feel that you are inadequate. You are never on your own. You're always in the presence of a God who journeys with you, who encourages you, who will give you the right words to say. And that, I think, puts that in a different perspective. Or you might say, well, maybe that's right. But even so, I'm not very good with arguments. If Richard Dawkins were to walk into that door, I wouldn't know what to say to him. Well, again, I want to say something. We're talking about the church as a whole. And think of Paul's beautiful image of the church as the body of Christ. We're all members. And sure, there are some people who, if Richard Dawkins walked through that door, would give him a very hard time. And they're part of the body of Christ. And it's good that they're there. But it's also wonderful that there are lots of other people there as well who can, in effect, talk about their faith to people at a much more ordinary level, who are able, in effect, to have conversations over coffee, who are able to, in effect, say, look, I'm not very good at explaining things, but my faith's a bit like this. And what I'm saying to you is, each of you will be able to find the right words to put what matters about your faith into words for this group of people, for that group of people. And I think it does help if you're doing this with support from your friends. I think that is an important point to make. C.S. Lewis, who did a lot of this thing, wrote several letters saying how lonely he found he became when he did this, because he felt he was very, very isolated. And we do need to figure out a way of supporting people as they do this. But let me, if I may, go back to this changing cultural context in which we're living. And we've talked a bit about this transition from modernity to postmodernity. And what I want to talk about a little bit is the way in which the Christian faith connects up with this transition very well indeed. I'm going to focus on how we might use one of Paul's images for salvation when he talks about being adopted as children of God. Adopted as children of God. You might think of Romans 8, for example. We live in a culture in which a lot of people feel they don't belong anywhere. It's especially true of younger people. In England at the moment, we have a very big problem with gang culture. And the reason why we're having this problem is that young people just feel they don't matter, and they gain identity by belonging to a gang. It's very, very sad, but it's happening. And the whole image of adoption is very, very powerful. It's about, in effect, bringing people from outside into a context in which they become important, in which they matter, in which they are welcomed, in which they belong. And that word belong is very, very rich. This is where I belong. And that's, in effect, trying to say to us, look, that one of the things that Christianity does is give us this deep sense of belonging, this deep sense of being part of something that's more important. It also, I think, helps us to understand what role the church plays in all of this. Because in many ways, what the church is there is as a kind of family that's able to welcome people out in and somehow mirror or reflect the love of God towards people. And again, I've met people who have come to faith simply by coming to church and seeing love in action and beginning to ask questions like, what is it that makes these people behave in this way? Whatever it is, it's something that I want to discover. So what I'm trying to say to you is that there are things that really need to be done. The future of Christianity here in Bermuda is important. The future of the church here in Bermuda is important as well. And each of us has something we can do to help with that. And so what I want to say to you is that we really do need to think about this. It's very, very easy to say, look, it's not for me, it's for them, or this is the sort of thing the clergy ought to be doing. But actually, all of us have a role to play in this. C.S. Lewis played a very, very significant role, and as you will all know, he was an Anglican layman. So I just want to say to you, there is much that needs to be done. And I believe that God is calling you to begin to think, I wonder what I could do. I wonder what there is that I might be able to do that will really make a difference to move things ahead. So I'm going to end in a moment, and then we'll open up for a wider time of discussion. But I want to end by making what I think is a very simple, but nevertheless very important point. And it's this. When I was researching my C.S. Lewis biography, I looked at his family tree. I tracked back who his parents were, who his grandparents were, and it was really very, very interesting. But here's my point to you. Each of you has a family tree of faith. It may be the family into which you were born, who really modeled faith to you, helped you to understand what it was all about, who brought you to a point where, in effect, it became part of your life as well. It may have been a sermon you heard or a conversation with somebody else that actually made you move towards Christianity when previously you've been some distance from it. But there are people who will be part of your family tree. And you can track each of them back as well, through their family, through their conversations, until we all end up with a family tree that begins with us and ends up with that upper room in Jerusalem. It's a wonderful family tree. And I think it's something that's really important. Each of us is rooted and connected in history. And that's a great thought, but it's also an unsettling thought, because the unsettling thought is this: and who will look back to me as being part of their family tree of faith? It's an interesting thought, it's unsettling, but it just reminds us that we're all in this together. There's something that each of us might be able to do that will move things ahead. And my job today really has been both to reassure you. You're not like, a car salesman trying to sell some very, very dodgy second-hand car. You've got something which is really rather wonderful. You don't need to be Albert Einstein. You just need to be a person who's willing to talk about the difference that faith makes to your life. I want to reassure you, the gospel makes a lot of sense. You can do far more than you think. And I want to challenge you and ask, what is there that you could do? Now, I can't answer that question for you, I'm afraid. I've got to leave that one with you. But it's a very important question, and I count myself very privileged to be able to ask it of you this morning here in Bermuda. Thank you very much indeed for listening.